Question number 4. Will the map be printed or displayed on a television or computer screen? Significant differences between print and display methods require you to consider aspects such as size, resolution, and the color model to be used as well. As we discussed in the color lecture, when we're designing for maps that are going to be displayed on a screen, we might want to choose to work with the additive color model, the RGB model, because screens emit colors with varying combinations of red, green, and blue. Whereas if we are planning to print our map, we might want to design using the subtractive color model, CMYK, indicating that the primaries are cyan, magenta, yellow, and the key black for generating color maps. But color is only one consideration in how we mix colors. You can still use the perceptual dimensions of hue, saturation, value for design, regardless of if it's going to be printed or displayed on a screen. But that difference between being printed or displayed on a screen still affects other aspects. What screen? What size is that screen? What is the quality of that screen? Same thing for printing. What kind of surface are you printing on? What size will you be printing? And for both, you have to consider at what distance away will the map be viewed? Is the person going to be holding the map or looking at a screen close to them? Or is the screen going to be at a distance? Or is it going to be a poster at a distance or something else, right? All of these considerations about how the map is going to be distributed at the very end affect our considerations along the way. In terms of size and resolution, I want to make some comments about when we're exporting maps. Now, like, for example, when you go to ArcGIS Pro Export Layout, you might have noticed that you have many different file type options. Now, for the most part, we have been exporting to PDF or to JPEG because they're very easy to share on the course website, but you have other options available to you. And we're going to talk about some of those differences shortly. But one of the there's a few things I want to point out. First, always check where the file is being saved before you click save. I'm sure that you've already figured out the importance of this as you go along, but never forget to check so that you don't lose files. That pertains to every output that you ever create. Where is it being saved? Additionally, aside from file type, you might have to consider one of the parameters regarding resolution. That is most likely DPI. DPI stands for dots per inch. Sometimes you might see PPI, which reflects pixels per inch. It's based on the same concept, but honestly, the term that's used more often is DPI because that's what came first. Now, how does DPI work? Well, the larger the DPI, the more dots you're going to have per inch. That means that you're going to have the possibility of greater detail, and that's going to lead to larger file sizes. On the flip side, if you have a small DPI, that means fewer points are going to be drawn per inch. That's going to give you less detail and a smaller file size. And so here we have a Goldilocks and the Three Bears problem, where we want to have a DPI that's not too large, not too small, but just right. And as for just a good starting point, you might want to consider 300 DPI for most exports. Usually that is the default resolution. If you see less than that, you might get a lower quality result. If you see higher than that, it might take up too much space and take too long to export, and that might be unnecessary for your needs. You might also see DPI in other contexts, not just when you're exporting a map. For example, when I've used scanners and photocopiers before, I've noticed that sometimes the default resolution for scanning has been, say, 200 DPI. Problem with 200 DPI is that when I was scanning like a chapter from a book to share with a class, sometimes the text would just be very poor, but when I took it up to 300 or maybe even 400, although that started to increase the file sizes, the quality of the scan got much better. So you have to find the right compromise. And you might say, well, why not just make it as big as I can? I'm not worried about size. Well, even if you're not worried about the size, you do need to be concerned with whether or not that size is going to be accessible for someone else's device. All right. Just because you can crank it up to 1,000 DPI and make it work for you doesn't mean, one, that that's even necessary, or two, that that's accessible to somebody else. So find a good compromise, one that is still able to convey the details of your design without loss of quality, but not unnecessarily high when that's not needed anymore. So let's go over some of those export types like I mentioned previously. The export types are going to generally fall into two categories. We have raster types and we have vector types. Raster types include JPEGs, PNGs, TIFFs, which replace bitmaps. And when it comes to working with raster types, the higher the image quality leads to larger file sizes. And higher image quality is usually a function of how large the output cells are. When the output cells are very small, there's a lot of them, so you get a very high quality image. That takes up a lot of space. If you have a larger output cell size, it's going to take up less space, but then you're going to get less quality. So again, we have the Goldilocks and the Three Bears problem. You want something that's just right, not too large, not too small. As for our vector types, there are a few very unique vector types that are useful in different contexts. AI allows you to continue making edits in Adobe Illustrator. So this is something that a lot of cartographers, especially professional cartographers who make high quality maps all the time, like to do, especially those who are extremely artistic in nature. They like to export to AI and then continue the artistic elements in Adobe Illustrator. Another vector file type is the PDF. We've been using a lot of PDF exports. We have been creating vectorized files for the most part when we have been creating PDFs. That means that we can zoom in, zoom out, and for the most part, the image doesn't pixelate. Instead, it remains nice and crisp. That is generally true of all vector types. The only exception to that in a vector output is when you are exporting into vector something that contains a rasterized image. Like sometimes we use raster data sets in our maps and they're not going to be vectorized. And the result, they're still going to be rasterized, and those particular aspects of your export will pixelate. The rest won't, like text, point line and polygon symbols from shape files, they'll all scale really nicely. And then we have SVGs, which stands for Scalable Vector Graphic. This replaces EPS. SVGs they're somewhat commonly used, also not very commonly used. A lot of people aren't aware of what SVGs are, that they even exist. But they're easy to find. People use them for clip art and other things, but you can also use them as export formats for map designs. And they're really neat because they work really well on the web, and they're a wonderful alternative to most other web maps that use like the web mercators, their underlying projection. If that is not something you want to do and you want to have complete control over your design, export your map as an SVG and share it. Now, it might not be as interactive as some other web maps, but at least you have complete control over the design and how it appears, etc. Now, when it comes to the size of your vector export, depending on if it's AI, PDF, SVG, regardless of which one it is, the greater the complexity and number of the features, that's what's going to lead to larger file sizes. Clearly, we're not concerned about cell size because that's a raster issue. So instead, we're concerned about the number and complexity of features included in the export. If there's a lot, it's going to be a large file size. If there are a few, it's going to be a small file size. So we wouldn't necessarily say that raster or vector output types are larger or smaller than the other in general. I would not say that that's fair. It depends on how much data you're trying to share, and what the parameters of your export file type are. So there's no general rule that says vector is larger file size than raster, or raster is larger file size than vector. It's not that simple. There are too many variables at play. Now, as you are choosing your export file type, you want to also pay attention to labels and transparencies. For example, the reason why this matters is that sometimes vector types do not handle labels with halos very well. So it really helps to test in the desired export type to see if it supports all of the different features of your map, halos, transparencies, etc. Or if it doesn't. And if it doesn't, you might have to either choose a different export type. If that's not an option, you might have to make edits to your map. So some vector types do not handle labels with halos well. Some raster types cannot handle transparencies well. And instead of really maintaining true transparency, they have a tendency to flatten the map image. For example, JPEGs. JPEGs do not handle transparency very well. However, TIFF, GIF, PNG, they're all okay. They handle transparencies just fine. So in this figure on the left, we have a PNG 8 and GIF 8-bit color formats. They support index transparency, so no concerns about index there. On the right, a 32-bit format will support alpha transparency, which allows for any rate of transparency between 0, opaque, and 100%, which is fully transparent. So I know that's a little bit technical, but the moral of the story is test and carefully examine your results before you decide that you're done. While we're talking about our export types, especially if we choose an image file type, I want to bring up the issue of aspect ratio. Now, this is not something that's included in, honestly, any of our recommended readings or what have you, but this is something that I have noticed, and I'm surprised that it's not more commonly discussed. Aspect ratio. So aspect ratio is the ratio of the width to the height of your image, width to height. And it is best if you lock the original aspect ratio. Now, for example, you might want to make an exported map and include it in a PowerPoint or in a paper, what have you, and you need to fit it with other textual or graphical elements. You need to make sure that your aspect ratio is locked, that ratio between width and height, because if you need to resize your image, you don't want it to accidentally get resized more in width than in height, or more in height than in width, because that means that you are introducing distortion into your map design. And we are cartographers, we care about distortion. We're trying to minimize distortion as much as possible. And when you don't lock your aspect ratio and you are not careful to maintain it, you are introducing unnecessary distortion. So for example, the same map as shown on the previous slide has now been incorrectly stretched. In the image on the left, it's been stretched in the north-south direction. In the image on the right, it's been stretched in the east and west direction. And as you can tell, the map has a lot more distortion in it as a result of not respecting the aspect ratio. So if you can, lock your aspect ratio if that's not an option. Be careful, be very careful when you're resizing to maintain the proper aspect ratio. And honestly, I would say that this is a good rule to follow for images that are not just maps, but all images. I'm sure that most of us have seen the occasional PowerPoint or two that has images that have been stretched a little too much in trying to make them fit. You can be a little more creative in stretching or squishing than stretching or squishing images. You can adjust other aspects of your design rather than having to introduce distortion. So please watch out for this and don't introduce unnecessary distortion. All right, on your handout, Discuss the various aspects of whether or not the map will be printed or displayed on a television or computer screen. What do you always need to check when you're saving your files? What is DPI? Which one is recommended for printing? What's the relationship between larger and smaller DPI values? Compare and contrast the various raster and vector export types. What is aspect ratio? Why is it important? And identify the main source of distortion in the image to the right.